Hello class, it's Professor Streeter. In this video, I want to talk about the second essay assignment. We'll look at the prompt together, talk about some of the suggested topics and the parameters for the essay. It's due at the end of the semester, and this is your last big assignment. Let me say something up front. For this last essay, I really want you to take ownership of it and try to formulate a topic, a question, a problem, an issue that really matters to you, and put yourself into the paper. So think about issues that you cared about and thought about before you began taking this class, and maybe that you have returned to in some of your posts and some of your homework assignments, maybe even in your first essay, in your midterm, during class discussion. Questions that you keep coming back to, issues that keep returning in your mind when you think about the readings. And so the goal then is to write an essay that makes an argument, but that tries to work out a problem that you really care about, right? That really matters to you. And that way you can take something away from this semester that I think will be more meaningful, having worked through a project at the end that synthesizes some of the things you've been thinking about a lot, and that helps you understand something that matters to you, and that you can take away at the end of the semester. So that's I'm encouraging you to take that approach, right? To really make this paper your own. Let me put myself down in the bottom of the screen so we can look at the prompt together. So here it is. I shared this with you last week, and the first part of the assignment prompt just contains the basic parameters and requirements and deadlines for the essay. And that's because, again, I really want to encourage you to come up with your own topic. But just to remind you of the structure of an essay, it very much matters that you have an argument that you're making in about 5 or 6 pages. And that means you have a thesis that you're introducing in your introduction, that there are body paragraphs providing support for that thesis. There's a close reading of some of the texts that you've read in this class, and any outside texts that you bring, any research that you do. And you draw a conclusion, right? A concrete conclusion that works out the implications of your thesis, right? In the final paragraph of the essay. As before, the use of sources is important here. That I want to see that you're citing sources properly, and that you're using texts from our course to develop your argument. So you need at least 2 references to the required text for this course, 1 from each book. 1 from the ethical life, 1 from the fundamentals of ethics. But again, you can do your own research and analyze other texts as well, as long as they're relevant to the question and the problem that you're working through. The last day of class is Wednesday, December 8th, and that's the day that the essay is due. I will ask you to turn in a proposal or introduction before that, and then the rough draft I'd like you to turn in before Thanksgiving, so have a chance to look at what you're doing before we get back from Thanksgiving. Those are the only requirements, okay? If you have a topic that you've been wanting to write about, send me an email, now or in the next week or so that I can see what you're thinking about and give you some feedback. If you're really struggling, thinking about what you want to write about, I have given you many suggestions. So let me turn to the first. You could look at part 4 of the ethical life and choose a pair of articles from the moral problems section. Okay, so last week we read an article by Peter Carruthers on the moral standing of animals. Alistair Norcross has an article that takes a different position. So you could look at Norcross and Carruthers and compare their views on the question of what are our responsibilities to the other animals, if you're interested in that question. You could do some outside research on that topic. This week we looked at a pair of articles on the status of abortion, the ethics of abortion. There's also something by Marquis in The Ethical Life that takes up that issue. So you could look at, there's 3 different essays on the ethics of abortion, and you could develop an argument in response to the debate that those authors are engaging in. But you could approach it from your own point of view and relate it to what Thompson and Foote and Marquis are saying. Okay, so there's many different moral problems that are addressed in part 4 of The Ethical Life, and you could choose 2 or 3 articles from that section that take up different positions. And the goal then of the essay would be to draw a conclusion about the wider implications of the view that you are defending in response to the views, let's say, of Norcross and Carruthers on the status on the moral status of animals. Okay, so that's one approach you could take. You could also go back to the piece by Appia that we read in The Ethical Life, beginning part 4. What will future generations condemn us for? And there, the goal would not be to write about that piece, it's a very short piece, but to use it as a launching off point, right? To identify an ethical issue in our society that you think we should be taking more seriously. Here's an opportunity to write about sustainability. So for example, you could think about the theme of sustainability in connection to an ethical issue that you think really matters. The sustainability of our healthcare system. What does a sustainable healthcare policy look like? One that will benefit all groups in society, not just some groups. Right? So you could approach the topic of sustainability in the context of the social contract theory. Right? A sustainable healthcare policy is one that all stakeholders or all parties to the hypothetical contract would agree to. Right? Is a policy that's mutually beneficial for all on the condition that everyone follows the rules. So you could look at the social contract tradition and relate that to questions about sustainability. What is a sustainable climate change policy, right? The presidents of many of the major nations around the world are gathering in Glasgow, Scotland this week to hammer out climate change policy for the future. Okay, so that's an example of an ethical issue we face. You could also look at criminal justice system in our society. What is a sustainable criminal justice system, right? There was articles in the New York Times this week about the police departments using traffic stops as a way of raising revenue for the police department, but this leads to all sorts of problems on the highways when police officers pull people over for taillight problems, and then that leads to heated arguments in cars, and people end up getting hurt or arrested or even killed. So there's an interesting article in the New York Times about that. You know, should police departments be aggressively pulling people over for taillight problems, for example, on highways, as a way of raising revenue for the police department, right? So is that a sustainable policy over time, right? You could look at other policies in the criminal justice system and think about how sustainable are they, right? Do they benefit all members of society, or are they deeply unfair in some way? Okay, so I'm just thinking about things I've been reading. The Supreme Court, going back to the first topic, right? If you do want to look at the ethics of abortion, the Supreme Court is now taking up the case in Texas and considering whether that case is, whether that law, that statute in Texas is constitutional or not, right? So that's a pressing issue right now, right? The Supreme Court may be on the verge of overturning Roe v. Wade. Okay, so again, you could read some newspaper articles as a way of putting this into context and then develop an argument of your own that uses some of the ethical principles and some of the readings from the course to explain your concepts and develop your view. Okay, so if you're taking the second topic, right, explain the ethical issue that you've identified. Why is it important? Why should we care about it, right? And then you're going to apply at least 2 of the approaches to ethics that we've considered to that case, right? So maybe the contractarian approach and the utilitarian approach. And think about what should be done in response to this issue and why. And depending upon which approach you find more appealing, right? What does morality demand of us in this kind of situation, and why, right? If you're defending a social contract approach, okay, what does the contractarian say about, you know, what a sustainable healthcare policy looks like, right? For example. Okay, so that's an option. You can also go back to the midterm. I'm going to be grading your midterm this week, but you could look at what you wrote about if you chose the first prompt. The first prompt was to write about one of the case studies from the Fundamentals of Ethics. So you could go back and reread that short essay and develop it into a longer essay, or return to that case or construct a case of your own and develop a more extensive argument defending one of the approaches to ethics that we've looked at: the utilitarian approach, the Kantian approach, the contractarian approach, or another approach. If you have a different approach that you want to focus on, you could let me know. But those are the three main approaches to ethics that we've been looking at. And so you could return to that case from the midterm and defend one of those approaches, or compare it to a natural law approach, or to the ethical egoist approach, okay, or a divine command approach, right? So those were approaches to ethics we talked about earlier in the semester, okay? So going back to your midterm, using that case study or a thought experiment that you construct on your own to illustrate why one approach makes more sense than the other, right? And then draw a conclusion about the nature and the source of our moral responsibilities to each other based on your analysis to that case, or your analysis of that case. Okay. Alternatively, you could look at a different case from the midterm that you didn't write about, so you could sort of develop your midterm essay more extensively, or you could look at a case that you didn't talk about in the midterm. Okay, there are also many cases from the fundamentals of ethics that you could look forward to, right? Reading ahead in chapter 14, 15, 17, and 18, there are case studies at the end of those chapters. You could choose one of those to write about. But again, the point would be to develop a defense of one of the approaches to ethics that we've been considering in response to that case. The last ones give you a chance to look at specific questions, let's say 4 and 5, specific questions about Kant's ethics, right? What's wrong with lying? And thinking about the question of whether morality is absolute, right? Are there absolute moral principles that are that have no exceptions, right? Is it sometimes permissible to lie? Kant would say it's never permissible to lie, right? Why does he say that, right? So here he'd be explaining the principle of universalizability in the context of this question of whether we ever get to lie, as a way of analyzing Kant's account of duty and Kant's account of the goodwill. So that's an opportunity to write about Kant and the principle of universalizability. Question 5 looks at the principle of humanity. What's wrong with the actions of the consistent fanatic? It's perfectly consistent, but right. So it seems to be consistent with the principle of universalizability. But Kant appeals to something that he calls the principle of humanity to explain what's wrong with the consistent fanatic. So that's a way of also writing about Kant, right? How does Kant defend the principle of humanity, right? Why does he place so much importance on the value of autonomy or free will, right? You could also look at O'Neill, who's a Kantian, and she uses the principle of humanity to explain what our moral duties are to victims of global famine in her essay. Another way to approach that topic is to look at Singer's piece on famine, on global poverty. He's the utilitarian, and then compare that to O'Neill's approach. Right? Both Singer and O'Neill draw different conclusions about our responsibilities to people who are suffering from global poverty. Okay. Question 6 just asks you to give an analysis and critique of the theory of utilitarianism. Look at the theory of utilitarianism, consider objections to it, and then defend or reject it based on the argument that you've developed. And then draw a conclusion about the relationship between the rightness of an action and its consequences. Right? What have you shown about the relationship between an action and its consequences? In writing that essay, you should say something about what the fundamental measure of right action is. If you're defending the utilitarian, right, you would focus on the consequences. If you're criticizing the utilitarian, then what is the fundamental measure? You could also, question 7 gives you a chance to think about the contractarian approach, going back to the week 10 discussion, or looking at the homework that's due this week about the contractarian approach. And then finally, you could write a letter. And we can talk about this option in class because I'm running out of time. But you could write a letter to a local representative identifying a public policy initiative that matters to you, that raises interesting questions, and proposing a solution to the problem. Okay? That includes a research part, so you'd have to submit a research summary of what you did, not just the letter, but we can talk about that in class. We have run out of time. We can return to this in class this week. Okay, hope that helps. Bye.